I had seen it all before, 2 years in a row, at my company's New Year's Eve parties. But what she did this time and how my story ends, you'll be shocked. There she was, surrounded by my rich, self-satisfied coworkers, gliding through the room like she owned it. Josephine, my wife, was being passed around like a platter of hors d'oeuvres. Every manager, every executive she could get her hands on was kissing her, caressing her, fawning over her like she was the centerpiece of the night. And George, my clueless, born-rich boss, was the worst of all, holding her with a disgusting tenderness that made my stomach turn. I knew what to expect because the last 2 years had been exactly the same. The first time, I convinced myself it was just the champagne. She'd had a bit too much to drink, I told myself, but last year things became too obvious, too blatant to ignore. I started making preparations then, knowing it was only a matter of time before I'd have to take action. As I stood there stewing, someone tugged on my coat. I turned to find Deirdre, Josephine's best friend and accomplice. "Happy New Year, Mike," she chirped, rising on her toes to give me the annual pity kiss. I leaned down reluctantly, brushing my lips against hers before pulling away. Her dark brown eyes met mine, but tonight they weren't sparkling with the usual mischief. No smirk, no knowing grin like she usually gave me, like she was part of some exclusive club I'd never be allowed to join. Instead, she looked at me with pity, maybe even concern. "Mike," she said softly, "don't take this so seriously. It's just the tradition, you know? A few kisses, a little fun. It doesn't mean anything. She'll come back to you soon enough, and she'll show you how much she loves you." I stared at her, trying to decide. She actually believed the garbage she was spewing. "She loves me, huh?" I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Interesting way to show it. At her office Christmas party last week, she spent the entire evening under the mistletoe with her coworkers. And now, here at my company's party, she's doing the same thing. Dancing, kissing, and, let's not sugarcoat it, sucking up to the executives. Except for me, of course. So let me get this straight. By kissing everyone else in the room except her husband, she's somehow proving her love for me? Is that what you're trying to say? Deirdre winced, clearly caught off guard. "Mike, she's just lively, you know? She's social. That's who she is. And you're more reserved, quieter. Sometimes she needs to connect with people who are more like her. But that doesn't mean she loves you any less." I let out a bitter laugh. "Right, I'm sure that's why she rented a room at this hotel, so she could connect with people." Deirdre's face went pale. She tried to backtrack. "Mike, come on, that's not fair." "Oh, it's fair," I cut her off. "And you knew, didn't you? Don't even bother denying it. You've been her accomplice this whole time." I turned my back on her and walked to our table. Underneath it, I pulled out the briefcase I'd placed there earlier. I opened it, pulling out a brightly wrapped package I'd prepared in advance. Turning away from Deirdre, I slipped my wedding ring off my finger and tied it to the bow on the package. Then I faced her again and shoved it into her hands. "Here," I said coldly. "When she finally breaks free from her fan club, give this to her. Tell her it's from me. A little parting gift to mark the end of our marriage." "Mike, no!" Deirdre cried, grabbing my arm as I turned to leave. "Don't do this. She's just had too much champagne again. You have to take her home." I shook her off. She doesn't need me. She's got everything she needs right here. Her car, her room, her admirers. I'm sure George, or one of the other dozen men she's been making out with tonight, will be more than happy to take care of her. Or maybe they'll all take turns. I don't care anymore. Deirdre's face crumpled as I continued. "Don't look at me like that. You fed me these same lies last year. I gave her this year to make her choice. She chose, and so did I. Goodbye, Deirdre. And you know what? It's a relief to know I'll never have to see you again." I turned and walked out of the ballroom. On my way, I caught Helen's eye. Helen was our HR director, and earlier that day, we'd spent hours reviewing financial documents while my boss and his buddies were handling business at the hotel. I knew exactly what kind of business they were handling. They were in a luxury suite that George had charged to the company card, and they were having their fun with my wife. I had photos and videos to prove it. So did Helen, and within minutes, the chairman of the board would have them too. As I walked out, Helen and her husband, a towering ex-football player, made their way toward the crowd around Josephine. Deirdre, still clutching the package I'd given her, was pushing through the throng of men. Josephine's name left her lips in a high-pitched cry, startling everyone. Josephine froze, her arms still wrapped around George. Slowly, she turned to look at Deirdre, confusion written all over her face. She frowned at Deirdre's frightened expression, clearly confused. Helen, standing nearby, smiled faintly, as if she already knew what was coming. Deirdre handed over the package I'd left and leaned closer to say something to Josephine, who cocked her head, squinting in disbelief. "Mike left this for you," Deirdre said nervously. "He's gone, Joe. He watched you flirt and cuddle all night, and when you started kissing all these men, he handed me this package and left." Josephine rolled her eyes and chuckled. "Oh, you know Mike. He throws these little fits whenever I don't give him enough attention for a few minutes. I'll go home, ask for forgiveness, and then we'll have sex. After that, everything will be fine. He loves me. Even when he's upset, he still leaves me gifts. Let's see what it is." Deirdre hesitated. "Joe, I don't think this is—" But Josephine was already focused on untying the ribbon. She tugged at the bow impatiently, her manicured nails making quick work of it. When my wedding ring fell to the ground, she froze for a moment, her brow furrowing. "What is this?" she asked, confused. George, ever the eager participant, bent down, retrieved the ring, and handed it to her with a smug grin. "Isn't this your husband's wedding ring?" Josephine stared at it in disbelief, her fingers curling around the small gold band. Her expression shifted as she glanced back at Deirdre, who murmured, "I tried to tell you." Ignoring her, Josephine shook off the confusion and tore into the wrapping paper. Inside was a plain white gift box. Seeing it, she relaxed, her usual confidence returning. "See? It's heavy," she said brightly, giving the box a playful shake. She began peeling away the tape on the edges, still grinning. But when she broke the tape on the third side, the box opened and its contents spilled onto the floor. Glossy photos scattered everywhere, sliding across the polished tiles. Josephine crouched instinctively, gathering up the papers closest to her. Several others bent down too, curious about what she'd dropped. I can imagine the moment their eyes landed on those images, because it must have mirrored hers. Pure, wide-eyed shock. She froze, staring at the glossy sheets in her hand, her face drained of color. "No!" she screamed, the sound ripping through the ballroom like a fire alarm. The cry drew everyone's attention and a crowd began to form. Some of them gasped as they spotted the photos. Others simply stared, trying to process what they were seeing. Deirdre's mouth fell open in disbelief as she snatched one of the pictures from the floor. George, standing nearby, picked up one of the larger prints, a crisp 20, 20, and 30 shot, and pressed it against his tailored suit as if trying to shield himself from its contents. "What the fuck, Joe?" he roared, loud enough for half the ballroom to hear. The crowd stirred uncomfortably. People were murmuring now, bending down to retrieve the scattered images, and there it was, all laid out for everyone to see. Josephine, in compromising positions with other men. Not just a few shots, but dozens of them. The photos showed her and George, of course, but there were others. Josephine with executives from her own company. Josephine with my coworkers. Josephine with her bosses. The variety was, well, let's just say it covered nearly everything short of the Kama Sutra. I'd been meticulous in selecting the images, making sure there was no doubt about her willingness to engage in almost anything with anyone. Josephine's face twisted in horror as she tried to process what was happening. And then, just like that, she collapsed. Her body went limp and she fell backward. The only thing stopping her head from smacking against the hard tile floor was George's foot, which happened to be in the way. Deirdre let out a panicked gasp and dropped to her knees beside her. "Joe! Joe! Are you okay? Joe, wake up!" She lightly slapped Josephine's cheeks, her voice rising in desperation. "Talk to me, Joe! Are you all right?" Meanwhile, the rest of the room descended into chaos. More people were picking up the photographs now, passing them around like party favors. A few people gasped audibly as they scanned the explicit images. Some muttered awkwardly, trying to suppress laughter, while others just stood there, stunned. I wasn't there to witness it, but I'd played this moment over in my mind countless times. The humiliation, the shock, the undeniable proof of her betrayal laid bare for everyone to see, and I knew it wouldn't end there. By the time she regained consciousness, she'd find herself not only humiliated but also exposed. And for George and the other executives, well, they'd have bigger problems to worry about when the chairman of the board received the same evidence I'd left for him earlier that evening. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about justice. One of the women in the crowd suddenly turned and slapped her husband hard across the face. "You lustful goat!" she screamed as he stared down at the photo he was holding. "No wonder you don't have the energy to satisfy me." The man looked at her, stunned, until she swung her purse and smacked him directly in the eye. He yelped, clutching his face, only to drop to the floor in agony when she delivered a pointed kick to his groin with her stiletto. As he writhed on the ground, she knelt down and began methodically sorting through the photographs, scattered across the floor. After a few moments, she paused, held one up, and called out to the other women in the room. "Hey, you wives of the Taylor and Son management team, you might want to take a closer look at these. Your husbands are in here too, having their own fun with these sluts." A ripple of outrage spread through the room as 9 other women dropped to their knees, combing through the pictures with vengeance in their eyes. The men, who had initially tried to save face, began retreating, inching toward the exits as if they could escape the fallout. "There are flash drives here, too," someone announced loudly, holding one up. "Who knows what's on these?" You bastard, a blonde woman shouted, waving a photograph at a well-dressed older man nearby. Do you remember the terms of our prenup? You're bankrupt, you lying scum. Baby, I'm sorry, he stammered, backing away. It didn't mean anything. She came on to me. And it was only one time. I swear, she wasn't even as good as you. Lying bastard, she screeched, shoving 2 more photos of him and Josephine in his face. Then, fueled by rage, she marched toward him, shouting obscenities and brandishing the pictures like weapons. He tried to hold his ground, but eventually turned and bolted, his wife hot on his heels. Another woman stood in the center of the room, clutching her chest with one hand while waving a photograph in the other. Tears streamed down her face as her husband, his head buried in his hands, sobbed quietly beside her. It wasn't just anger and heartbreak playing out, though. A man standing nearby picked up a photo, stared at it in disbelief, and then held it out to the stunning woman in front of him. You slut! You told me you'd never have a threesome because you wouldn't do it with another woman. Her face turned bright red. Without a word, she spun on her heels and fled, her shaky steps nearly sending her toppling in her 10-centimeter stilettos. The chaos continued. Another woman grabbed a handful of photos, calling out names as she walked toward the center of the ballroom. One by one, women were handed photos, looked at them, and then turned to their husbands with expressions of absolute fury. Each time the reaction was the same. An enraged woman lunging at a retreating man, slaps, kicks, and a torrent of curses filled the air. Meanwhile, Josephine had regained consciousness. She sat upright in Deirdre's arms, her face pale and her eyes unfocused as she took in the madness around her. A man in an expensive tuxedo knelt beside her and asked gently, "Are you okay?" Josephine blinked at him, confused. "Who are you?" He handed her a stack of papers. Then, with a calmness that somehow cut through the chaos, he said, "I'm a bailiff. You've been served, Josephine Reynolds, Lord." Her face tightened in shock as she stared at the documents in her lap. "What is this?" "These are your divorce papers," he explained, raising his voice so the growing crowd could hear. "They include evidence of adultery submitted by Michael Morris Lord. Attached are the photographs and videos that confirm his claims." He turned to address the room, his voice now loud and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't yet had a chance to view the evidence, don't worry, the divorce filings are public records. You can access them online. For a nominal fee, you can also visit cheatingspousepa.com for a full archive of Josephine's exploits, including names, dates, and locations of her activities. Digital copies are available upon request and are particularly useful in court." With that, he gave a theatrical bow and strode away, leaving behind a wake of tears, fury, sheer panic. Josephine sat frozen, clutching the divorce papers as the weight of everything finally settled on her. She scanned the faces of the crowd, searching for a shred of sympathy, but all she saw was hatred, pity, and disgust. For the first time in her life, the admiration, envy, and lust she'd taken for granted were nowhere to be found. Her privileged world had crumbled in an instant, leaving her utterly exposed and alone. She buried her face in Deirdre's chest, sobbing uncontrollably. George, meanwhile, tried to salvage what he could. "Get rid of those damn photos," he barked at his lackeys. "Burn them, now!" Turning to Helen, our HR director, he snarled, "I want Mike Lord reprimanded immediately. Have his termination papers on my desk Monday morning." Helen, standing with her husband, maintained a neutral expression. "I'm sorry, Mr. Taylor, but Mr. Lord resigned this afternoon. He gave 2 weeks' notice, used the vacation days you approved last week, cleared out his office, and left the building." George's face turned red with fury. "I don't care if he resigned. I'll fire him myself. He'll never work in this industry again." "Again, I'm sorry, Mr. Taylor," Helen replied coolly, "but Mr. Lord already met with the chairman of the board. Your father personally accepted his resignation, and Mr. Lord has already secured a position with another firm, one you authorized him to consult with, sir." George's face was nearly purple now, his curses barely coherent as Helen and her husband exchanged a satisfied glance. As for me, I was long gone, driving south in my brand new Chevrolet Suburban. I'd ordered it months ago, and it had arrived just in time for my move. The GPS estimated it would take 24 hours and 32 minutes to reach my new home in Austin, Texas. And for the first time in years, I felt free. I knew the drive wouldn't take just 24 hours. In truth, it would probably stretch to a week because I planned to savor the journey. I wasn't just heading south, I was escaping the mess I'd left behind in New York and rediscovering the parts of the country that still made sense to me. Once I hit Virginia, I intended to leave the highways behind and take the country roads, the kind John Denver sang about. I'd pass through the small towns in the Carolinas, that Mary Chapin Carpenter described in her songs. I'd stop at roadside stands for jars of homemade jams and jellies, eat where the locals ate, and soak in the quiet, deliberate pace of life far away from the city's chaos. The thought of it made me smile. My new Chevy Suburban hummed beneath me, a gift to myself, paid for right before I separated our accounts. Sure, Josephine had earned far more during our marriage, probably 10 times the amount. But the $88,000 SUV felt like poetic justice. Her money bought it, and now it was taking me to my new life. The divorce terms I'd laid out were generous. I'd keep my investments in pension funds. She'd keep hers. She could have the penthouse and her precious trust fund if she signed the papers within 10 days. It was more than fair. I had the radio tuned to Sirius XM's Roadhouse channel, blasting traditional country. Josephine hated country music almost as much as she hated retro rock. I chuckled, switching to classic vinyl, just because I could. For the first time in years, I felt free. Last year, when the New Year's ball dropped, I made a decision. I spent the next 12 months quietly preparing, gathering the evidence I needed, and planning my escape. I knew Taylor and Son might limp on without me, but I doubted it. George's leadership was a joke, and without the design improvements and patents I'd brought to the company over the past 5 years, I gave it a year, maybe two, before it collapsed. The thought of George squirming made me grin. Last year, over half the company's new sales and profits were thanks to my work, and now I had even better developments ready to launch with my new company. Randolph Taylor, George's father and the real brains behind Taylor and Son, would probably sell the company before it completely tanked. But George? His reputation would burn before that happened. I imagined the fallout from tonight's party, the photos, the humiliation. The truth about George and Josephine laid bare. Helen had called earlier, thrilled with how it all played out. She'd scattered the photos beautifully, just as I'd planned when I designed that box to fall apart. Josephine's parents would hear about it soon, too. They never liked me. To them, I was just a farm boy from Idaho. My degrees, a bachelor's in engineering from the Colorado School of Mines and a master's from the University of Michigan, meant nothing compared to an Ivy League pedigree. They'd always thought their precious daughter had married beneath her. I smiled to myself, thinking about the destruction I'd left behind. Back in New York, Deirdre and her husband, Albert, had taken Josephine home. As soon as they stepped into the penthouse, she broke down again, sobbing uncontrollably. On the drive, she'd rehearsed a speech, convinced she could talk her way out of this. She told herself she could explain everything, that the affairs didn't mean anything, that they hadn't hurt our marriage. She was just influencing decisions or exploring new things to spice up our relationship. She even rehearsed saying that sleeping with other men had helped her control her desires and made her a better lover for me. Even as she practiced, she knew it sounded ridiculous. She knew I wouldn't buy it. I was too old-fashioned for that. I took our vows seriously. When she walked into the apartment and saw that all my belongings were gone, she crumpled to the floor, sobbing bitterly. That was when the reality of her situation hit her. She'd always assumed she'd never get caught. And even if she did, she was certain she could charm her way back into my good graces. But tonight, I'd burned it all to the ground. Our marriage, her reputation, everything. The week passed quickly for me. Before I left New York, I cloned my SIM card so I could stay in touch without interruptions. My old phone was discarded, buried in the dirty city snow. I had no intention of answering calls or emails from anyone except the people I'd chosen to contact. Each day of that week, carefully timed emails went out to the spouses of those caught in the photographs and videos. One by one, marriages across New York were igniting, burning down just like mine. I smiled at the thought. Yesterday, I sent the email to Albert. That one felt particularly satisfying. Josephine was responsible for her own actions, but Deirdre, she played a part in this mess. Her stories about the joys of her promiscuity had clearly influenced Josephine's decisions. By day 4, back in New York, the fire was still spreading. Deirdre and Josephine sat on the couch in what was now their apartment. Albert had kicked Deirdre out after receiving my email and watching the attached video. The video featured 5 clips of explicit activity, including a candid conversation between Josephine and Deirdre, where they bragged about their conquests and mocked their clueless husbands. Albert had made good use of it, sending copies to the wives of every named man. The flames were spreading, and Albert, like me, seemed to enjoy watching it all burn. Things weren't going any better for George. The fallout from the New Year's party hit him like a freight train. His father, Randolph, fired him on the spot and stripped him of his inheritance. The old man also cleaned house, terminating every senior executive involved in the scandal that had led to the firm being blackballed. Randolph took over as interim CEO and placed Helen, my ally and the company's new VP of Development and Talent Acquisition, in charge of recruiting fresh talent. She was bringing in top executives from across the globe to rebuild the company I'd helped create but without George or the corrupt mess he'd left behind. Meanwhile, I'd finally arrived in Austin, Texas. Passing the Martin Luther King Boulevard exit, I turned onto Cesar Chavez Street. The city felt alive, vibrant, and full of opportunity. Exactly what I needed after leaving the toxic wasteland of New York behind. Driving past the Austin Convention Center, I caught a glimpse of Lady Bird Lake to my left. Moments later, I crossed Congress Avenue and pulled into the parking garage of my new home, an exclusive high-rise apartment at 70 Rainey. My new company had covered 6 months' rent, giving me plenty of time to settle in and start house hunting. I already knew what I wanted: a quiet home with a yard full of trees, a place where I could plant roots and build the kind of life I'd always dreamed of. Once I found it, I'd get a dog, something loyal, dependable, and honest, unlike the people I'd left behind. My new partners had big plans for me. They were throwing a barbecue in a few weeks to introduce me to the team and the community. They'd promised me there would be plenty of eligible women there. I wasn't in a rush to start dating, but the thought of meeting someone reliable, someone who actually valued loyalty, wasn't so bad. I wanted a real partner, someone who'd help me build a home filled with love, laughter, and maybe even children one day. Back in New York, the fire I'd lit was still burning out of control. Spouses exposed by my evidence were scrambling to save themselves, throwing others under the bus in the process. Hurt spouses were sharing what they knew, and alliances were crumbling left and right. It was a beautiful kind of chaos, and Helen kept me updated every step of the way. As I settled into my new life, I couldn't help but smile at the thought of it all. The ever-growing flames consuming the liars and cheaters I'd left behind, I had no regrets. Leaving New York was the best decision I'd ever made.